Okay, there we go. So it is 25th of July, 2025. And I'm attempting to move toward understanding and articulating the rest of chapter 5 in psychological types, um, which, like talking about the Brahmanic conception of the problem of opposites from page 195. And there's rather a lot of material that's necessary to understand before that point. Um, so I've been, deeply engaged in the study of the Red Book and trying to understand why Jung is so focused on extroversion and introversion, and what does he mean by the self. And so there's an understanding of a mediating process, a process that mediates between the opposites, between any pair of opposites, which is also a symbol, and trying to understand what Jung means by that and what he means by the symbol of the self. Mm. And for me, that understanding is important because it's very much an aid to understanding what's happening in my life now. So it has a very personal um, importance and quality. Yeah. So I wanted to do a little review of some of the main concepts that we're talking about here that can put us in a position to appreciate new understanding that has been reached, namely what is the transcendent function and how does it relate with the concept of the self, and what is the connection between mm, the symbolic nature of the self and the enacting of the transcendent function. So, and to do that, I'm going to draw on the most important notes from the introduction to the Red Book, um, which I'm going to briefly review to get us into this. So this is a brief review of some of the main important material from Sono Samdashani's introduction to the Red Book. Um, Psychological types is drawn from mostly the three visions that encompass about 30 pages in Liber Primus, first volume of the Red Book, entitled Mysterium Encounter, um, and finishing with Resolution. And I'll quickly find out which of the other names are Instruction. Yeah, so Mysterium Encounter, Instruction, and Resolution basically formed the entirety of psychological types as indicated within the Red Book. Um, I don't yet understand those visions. It deeply has to do with this combination of logos and eros. And for Jung, it really has this quality of it's a descent, right? It's a descent back to his own depths, which is also his evil, and for him his feminine and his feeling. Those are all. It's like a reintegration of everything that he had forgotten and lost that allows him to enter relationship with his own soul. So anyway, after those visions, which occurred through November and December in 1914, I believe. Check to make sure I've got that right. A couple of years later, so he didn't at that point yet understand the self. He hadn't yet come up with the self or understood it as distinct from the ego. But it was his first pass over the most important material that led to that point. And he had already had several encounters with his soul and talked about that. written about that. Now, on January 16, 1916, so several years later, he drew a mandala in the Black Books, the first sketch of the Systema Munditodius, which is a pictorial cosmology of the seven sermons of the dead. It later became sort of the basis of the Gnostic cosmology that he ended up producing to articulate what he'd experienced. And he reproduced those mandalas in the Red Book, and it was during that period that the idea of the self first came to him. And so I had this insight, understanding this concept of the self. It's really a symbol of the, well, let's define it. He says, quote, "The self, I thought, was like the monad which I am, and which is my world." So even just there, it's like if you imagine you and your entire world, your entire experience together, that is for Jung like the self. And he says the mandala represents this monad and corresponds to the microcosmic nature of the soul. Yeah, the microcosmic nature of the soul. So it's a but it has a developmental quality. It says at this point he did not know where the process was leading, but began to grasp that the mandala represents the goal of the process. Only when I began to paint the mandalas did I see that all the paths I took, all the steps I made, all led back to the one point, that is to the center. The mandala became the expression of all paths. So he started to understand the significance of the self as containing his vision of the reborn God. So there's an idea that God is in the process of being reborn and we are giving birth to God, to a new version of God, through our souls. So there's an idea here of entering into relationship with one's soul, whereby one can allow one's soul the space, the freedom to commune with the unconscious or with God, take your pick, to commune with the creative energy within the unconscious. And that as a result of that process, the soul is made pregnant. It's again symbolized by Pandora and her jewel, or Maya giving birth to the Buddha. And the soul, according to Jung, is pregnant with it's pregnant with the self, pregnant with the new version of God, and the symbols of the self emerge from that process. So there's a way that in the world, when there is an irreconcilable conflict, say, for example, human life wants to continue on Earth, but the meta crisis sort of gets in our way. It's a conflict between opposites. The idea is that this causes a sort of regression into a state of introversion. So when we can't move forward in the outer world, let's say, then we go back into the inner world to work out a resolution to the conflict. And this is exactly what Jung was up to, a deeply introverted condition. And in that condition, exactly the process occurs, which I'm describing, whereby one, by going within, can enter into, it doesn't have to be the soul, it can be a Socratic daemon, for Vicky, it's Hermes, talking about the sacred second self or divine double, which for Jung is the soul or anima. I think we can see from Jung that it may have to do with reconciliation between the more conscious half of one's personality and the qualities about one which were disallowed or denied. So I'm talking specifically about those aspects of one's soul with which one may not be pleased. So, for example, the qualities of Kali, for example. This is one example. This is what showed up for Jung. So, because he's like a very somber and serious, masculine, scholarly figure, relying a lot on logos, on forethought, on intuition and thinking. His descent into his introversion into his unconscious involves dialogue with and eventually um, acknowledging one's identity with the opposite qualities, namely um, what is youthful, feminine, oriented towards feeling, towards sentiment, towards desirousness, towards lustfulness, towards everything that for Jung is lower. And it seems that for Jung, the deflation of the ego, which is represented by realizing that it's okay to allow those qualities to be a part of one. This is a kind of humbling or humiliating process, right? This is coming back down to the humanity of who we really are. Um, this is a process of, in the inner world, giving one soul scope to exist in that way. Um, so allowing within one, in the inner world, whatever qualities, attributes had previously been disallowed. For Jung, this is how the soul is then given space or permission, one could say, to enter into communion with a living creative intelligence that is the ground of the psyche, all still within an introverted condition in a process of inner imagery. The idea is that the soul then there's a actually a kind of polyamorous quality, um, at least for Jung, where yeah, the soul is essentially made pregnant by that creative intelligence. Um, you don't have to say made pregnant, you can say infused with, if you like. But I mean, it has to do with the mythology of the Immaculate Conception. Um, I mean, the Virgin Mary. And yeah, the significance of that is that obviously the Virgin Mary, like in the sense of the water of life, it's out of that womb that the divine Son emerges. So the divine Son is a symbol again of the self. So the self is what is the self? Yeah. I would say it's an emerging center of consciousness. It's a new form of consciousness, perhaps. It's a new version of God, perhaps. Well, I think we can see that pretty clearly at this point. Um, it may be that the self is a sort of it's like one of the jewels on Indra's net, you know. It's like the microcosmic version or aspect. What I'm connecting with here is that this self is something that emerges in a deeply introverted condition within us, and we receive symbols of it after it has been conceived. The notion of the transcendent function is the process whereby that new symbol, that new center of consciousness is able to be brought from within to be lived. And that also involves the establishing of a new way, a new center of life. Because the significance of the uniting symbol is that from that moment, the highest intensity of life is to be found only in this new direction. It's a new symbol, a new expression of life at its most intense. So it's a kind of divine birth. So as we said, it has to do with this transcendent function. It's a symbol that unifies the opposites, but it's not a thing, it's a process. But the thing is that it's both. It's in the sense of an object, but it's not just an object, right? It's a way. And so we have this in the sense of I am the way and the truth and the light. It's something to, like, it can be represented in as a thing, but it can also be participated in as a process. And I would say that both of those modes are important. Yeah, so at that point we can see that when we go into this deeply introverted condition as a result of the irreconcilable conflict between the opposites in the quote unquote real world, there can be as a function of relating with one's soul appropriately with humility and dignity, the symbol of the self can emerge deep within. It can then be, I want to say that it's not just yes, we receive symbols of it, but we also learn to bring that new center of consciousness into the world in the form of symbolic language. So if it really is a new center of what has been called God, that we participate in by moving deeper into our own individuality, into our own soul, then we can understand that it has a deeply unifying function, meaning it has this function of unifying or integrating the split between the different functions that Jung talks about: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. He argues that symbols have this quality, that they can be approached from all of those directions, right? So this is the idea that the symbols that we receive, they're not just representative, they're actually the best form of language that we have to approach this emerging center of consciousness and to participate in it. This also allows us to appreciate the significance of geometric structures, mandala-like structures involving sacred numbers, or just numbers, like harmonic resonances. Again, this is sort of like a Pythagorean material. It has to do with like these, the deepest sense-making tools that have been discovered by mankind, having to do with shamanism, shamanic speech, number, measure, geometry, mathematics. That these, in a sense, most primordial and deepest forms of mapping, sense making, and expressing, they all help us to describe and articulate the outlines and participate in the manifestation of this emerging center of consciousness. Um, the idea is that we receive the symbols of this, we receive symbols of this from the unconscious in the form of images, but it can then be converted or transmuted alchemically, so to speak, uh, from the place in the body where it emerges. And I think I think it must emerge as a felt sense. I'm not sure. And the idea is that it can then be like there's a quality of receiving from the unconscious, right? And this again, it has to do with um, humbling the will before the creative agency of the unconscious, and uh, like really understanding, hey, we can't move forwards. We're stuck. Help us, or unconscious. And then it does. Um, and then the idea would be to there's reception of revelation of some kind in the form of the emergence of the center of the self within one, um, that then can be, and indeed should be, transmuted into extroverted form. And that's important because in the story of Pandora, when Prometheus came up with this new center, his brother Epimetheus, the extrovert, did not appreciate it. And so there's this success at the introverted step of the process, but then it couldn't be brought into life. It couldn't be brought into actuality. And this is obviously important. So the transcendent function, this is why I say it has to do, it's not just a symbol, right? And it's not just a center. And it's also a process. It's a way of life. And yes, it can involve symbolic language and kind of recovery of shamanism, but it also involves sort of new considerations guiding our decisions and actions, such that there's this back and forthing process, again, the cycling process between the introverted uh, condition, where we get a deep internal sense of this self of which Jung speaks, and bring that into the world in the form of creative expression, in the form of um, primarily speech, I would say, but through different means of participation. Yeah, so the reason for the significance of the transcendent function is that the transcendent function is this mediating between the states, the different steps of this process of introversion and extroversion. And it's very important not to get stuck in one of those two phases. And so the transcendent function is a term which can be used to describe this mediating symbol that demonstrates how it's something which can be enacted. It's a way of life. It's not just it's not an object or a thing. It's a new manner of being in the world. Mm. And the transcendent function is this process of cycling back and forth between these introverted and extroverted conditions. Okay, that feels pretty clear at this point. I'm going to pause for a bit. One thing to add here is that Jung, especially in those visions that I mentioned, the three, mysterium, encounter, instruction, and resolution, the deepest pair of opposites that seemed to be relevant for him was that between not just masculine and feminine, but logos and eros, where logos is connected with um, forethought, as in intuition, as in Prometheus, and eros is connected with um, Salome and feeling, yeah, sensation. Um, and the reason that that's important is because like when we talk about these, again, symbols, and even I want to start talking now about geometric structures, um, which one could think of as again, the concept of hyperobjects from you can look that up from Graham Harman, I think, object-oriented ontology. This is sort of like n-dimensional structures that are implicitly present in space and time. And the notion of becoming more conscious of them and participating in them could serve a unifying role within groups, and that the emergence of the self as a center of consciousness is something like that. So again, we're not just talking about mandala symbolism here in terms of like two-dimensional symbols that are drawn, say, but they're n-dimensional hyperobjects that can be sensed and felt into. What's important about that is that there is a cycling between sort of form and essence, by which I mean logos and eros, which feels critically important. So again, one of the key risks here is like how to avoid possession, how to avoid this unconscious flow of very powerful creative energy. How can that be bounded, constrained, limited, and directed? And the idea is that these symbols and indeed these structures, they perform that function. So this has to do with the deepest limiting, bounding, sense-making capacities that are available to mankind. It is these functions that we have, the capacity that we have to create symbols, to sense symbols, to feel them, to think them, to intuit toward them, to approach them in all these ways. This is the deepest kind of sense-making architecture that is available to mankind, I would argue. And it's therefore our deepest way of approaching, I think the emerging center of the Godhead, and understanding that and appreciating that in a way which doesn't cause complete overwhelm. So it's a process that involves, again, it's when I talk about like discovering new or reinventing old forms of symbolic language. It might involve changes to our language, to how existing language is used. Like I don't necessarily mean invention of new words, but it may be connected with the process of speaking in tongues, glossolalia. I'm not sure. And again, this is like we're trying to approach and understand a process which is at the edge of reality, the edge of what is understandable by human beings. And we can see here that it's this combination of logos and eros. It's this combination of structure and essence. These n-dimensional hyperobjects, or geometric structures and symbols, they serve as receptive vessels into which this primary creative vessel, creative energy, can be infused, like it infuses into them, and so they become charged with libido, with psychic energy. They become charged up from the depths, although also from the heights. It's like emergence and emanation as well. From again, it's like this kind of a cycle. That might do. I just wanted, like, I'm trying to articulate what is the importance of the structures that I speak of, and the structures serve this like could like creative constraints. It's like putting limits, putting bounds on creativity in a way that serves. So it's a way to bring this creative energy into the world for the first time in a way that's understandable and shareable among humankind. That is like similar enough to what we can already do that it's something that we can pick up on. This is why I talk about like it's a new way of life, right? It may be a new way of speaking, maybe a new way of communing. We're not sure at this point, but it importantly involves this deep combination of um, form and essence. And indeed, the thing is that that form is actually built into our bodies. Like we have a very we are a form of life, and so there's a way that this discovery of a new center of life force, life energy may serve to, in the sense of from one becomes two, two becomes three, from the third comes the one as the fourth. It may be everything about us that has been in the position of the fourth, namely in the position of the unconscious, the body, nature. It's a process of that aspect of ourselves becoming more conscious. Comes the one as the fourth. Yeah, so it may be a process of alchemy within the body and um, waking up or opening up deeply from within the body, in the sense that when I speak of like these forms into which this um, energy is directed, they can be linguistic and symbolic forms, namely our language, our words, our symbols, and these n-dimensional geometric hyperobjects that I speak about. But it can also be the form which is built into our nature, our body, and not just our body either, but our entire being,